Hello, this is Donna with Sparrowstudios7, bringing you commentary on Genesis 8 with I read and I learn as we go through the Bible. So, everything about Noah's 8 is about what happened during the flood. It gives specifics about when the flood waters receded, that's most of the chapter, where the ark landed after, what Noah did, how he responded to everything to make sure that the ground was dry. And it also gives specific historical details from when the time of the flood started to when the flood waters receded, and Noah knew that it was time to leave. So I'm going to read just a couple of the notes like I normally do and then give you some of my thoughts as well. Chapter 8, verse 1, the note says, "But God remembered." This structural and theological center of the flood story does not mean that God had at any point forgotten Noah. This is covenant language reflecting God's faithfulness to his promise to ensure the safety of his covenant partner. We see that promise in chapter 6:18, which says, "But I will confirm my covenant with you, so enter the boat, you and your wife and your sons and their wives." In chapter 9:15 through 16, which we'll read tomorrow, Exodus 2:24, Leviticus 26:42, and verses 45 as well. The wind. The same word is translated spirit in Genesis 1:2. This and other parallels, see Genesis 9:1 through 2, suggest that the restoration of the earth after the flood was effectively a new creation. In chapter 8, verse 2, the underground waters and torrential rains. They want us to go back to chapter 7, 11 through 12. It mentions it. So I'm going to read those for you now. Chapter 7, 11 through 12. When Noah was 600 years old, on the 17th day of the second month, all the underground waters erupted from the earth, and the rain fell in mighty torrents from the sky. The rain continued to fall for 40 days and 40 nights. So that's the rain and the underground waters that were mentioned not only in chapter 7, but earlier on in chapter 2, where God made a note that before the flood, no rain had ever fallen on the earth, and underground springs were watering all of the plants and vegetation on the earth. So, the next one is about the mounds of Ararat. The mounds of Ararat, mentioned in chapter 8, verse 4, might be the region of Ararat or Urartu, south of the Black Sea, near Lake Van, which touches parts of eastern Turkey, Armenia, and Iran. There is a Mount Ararat or Agri-Dog in Turkey, but this verse only identifies the region, not a specific mountain. So it may have been close to Turkey, it may not have been, but that gives you a little bit more historical context, yeah? I don't know that either. I thought it was in Turkey, but I wasn't sure. So another parallel with Creation Week was in verse 5, but the waters continued to go down. And it suggests that the earth's restoration was effectively a new creation. So then it talks about the animals that Noah released, the raven and the dove. The notes for these are in reference to chapter 8, verse 7. The raven is the largest member of the crow family and was among Noah's unclean animals. We see that it's unclean in Leviticus 11:15 and Deuteronomy 14:14. As a scavenger and carrion eater, it was able to sustain itself without returning to the boat. Okay. Unlike the raven we see in verse 11, the dove feeds on vegetation. Since olive leaves are not tall, Noah could tell that the water was almost gone when the dove returned with an olive leaf in its mouth. And then in verse 13, it says, on the first day of the new year, 10.5 months after the flood began. This was 2 months after the mountains first became visible. And then in verse 14, the earth was dry. The special word for dry land is uniquely used in connection with the sea to portray God's sovereignty over both domains. So essentially, the sea went back to the original boundaries that God had put in place during the creation of the world. And the ground was safe to walk on for humans and the animals. So I'm going to jump one, because be fruitful and multiply means exactly what it says, to make more of the animals and everything. Yeah. So 8:20 goes and is the first mention of an altar in the Bible. And it says, see altars in 22:9-14. We'll read that in a couple of days. Shows Noah's gratitude for having passed through the judgment, sacrificed as burnt offerings. The same term is used for the whole burnt offering in Leviticus chapter 1, verses 3-9. However, it can refer to any offering that is burned. Noah gave this offering to thank and worship God, who had delivered him and his family from the flood. Now, if you remember, God specifically gave Noah instructions to bring more animals than was strictly necessary for food and for the repopulation of the earth. These were the animals that were extra. They were meant specifically for sacrifice to thank God for bringing them safely through the flood and for worship to Him. Then in 21, the note says, pleased with the aroma of the sacrifice. Literally smelled the sweet aroma. The narrator uses anthropomorphic language, i.e., he describes God's activity in human terms, to show God's acceptance of Noah's offering. See also Exodus 29:18, Leviticus 1:9, Numbers 15:3. The common ancient Near Eastern notion that the gods ate the sacrifices offered to them is notably absent. To himself, literally in his heart, the phrase echoes broke his heart in chapter 6, verse 6, where God made the decision to destroy the world with the flood when it broke his heart. Just as think or imagine echoes everything that they thought or imagined in Genesis 6:5, where everyone in the world, every thought of or imagined was evil. God's commitment to a new order replaced his grief over the old. I will never again curse or destroy. The old curse was not lifted, but God promised not to add to it, thus establishing new limits for life in a disordered world. We see this in Isaiah 54:9. The flood was to stop violence, not to reform the human heart. Humankind's bent toward evil would be contained to some degree through accountability to a new law. So even after God brought about the destruction of the earth through the flood, he accepted Noah and his family's sacrifice and promised to never again do this through water, so that we could have hope and the promise of a new future on the earth even after the initial destruction through the flood. Thanks and have a great night.